Thanks very much for that introduction. Gas wells have been in the news the past year. There's been the explosion at Wheatley, but there's been an ongoing issue in Norfolk County in the Big Creek Valley. Flowing wells have been going on for decades. Currently, Norfolk County is experiencing one on property that they own, and in looking what to do with it, they undertook a study to understand the geological and hydrogeological conditions that exist at the site and surrounding it. And this, of course, was so they could figure out what has happened when previous wells were plugged, what area is susceptible to flowing wells, and when this information is compiled, how does it inform what happens down the road with their well? For those of you who aren't familiar with where Big Creek is, it's southeast of London. There's Tillsonburg over there. Big Creek flows generally southward through the town of Delhi. The well we're going to be talking about is the Forestry Farm well. You'll see it abbreviated as FFR on some of the slides. It's located about 9.5 kilometers south of Delhi. If we zoom in on the site and you look at it, if you went, you would not see a well per se. What you'd see in this area is a bubbling cauldron that's about 5 to 10 meters wide. The sulphur water that's flowing from the well is pooled to the south. It's killed the vegetation. There is some concern that it may break through and flow directly into Big Creek, which is to the west of the site. What this slide doesn't show is the effect that the well is having on the immediate neighbors. Hydrogen sulfide affects them to various degrees depending upon the wind direction and climatic conditions. So this happened about 5 years, and they're not particularly happy about it. Okay. One of the first questions we were asked is, why is the well flowing? And this has actually been known for some time, and it was discussed this morning in Terry's presentation. The bedrock in the area is the Dundee Formation. It's a pressurized aquifer. Under natural conditions, the water is held down by a thick sequence of impervious sediments, the Port Stanley Drift. When a gas well, an oil well, or a water well is drilled down into the bedrock, water flows up to what we term the piezometric surface, shown here in blue. This is a slide from the source protection study that was done by Matrix in the area. What happens when the piezometric surface is above the ground surface, such as in the Big Creek Valley or the tributaries, is you have an Artesian zone. When we use the data from the oil and gas wells and the water wells in the area, which showed how high the water rose up when they intersected the bedrock, you can map out the Artesian zone, and it's shown here what looks like a lake. If you have a look here at all, you can see them, all these little gray spots around, they are the number of gas wells in the area. There are literally hundreds, so we have very good coverage in that sense. So the FFR well and the well I'm going to be making reference to, original and relief wells, are both located in this Artesian zone. Clearly, when you're drilling a gas well, you hit the bedrock, you put in your surface casing, you cement off this aquifer zone, and all is good. You have a dry well. Well, were that the case? Because what happens, due to the geochemistry of the water in the Dundee, you get corrosion on your casing, and in fact, you can have this cement attack. These are some of the older cements, not the newer ones, the sulfate-resistant cements that are used today. Thanks to Terry Carter, I pilfered some of his slides. Checks in the mail, Terry. Anyway, what you can see is the water attacks either the cement on the outside, it can attack the steel casing, and should it get inside, and you have some of these thin cement plugs that have been used in the past, it can attack them. So essentially then you have an open pathway to surface. So that's the where and the why of the flowing wells. Let's have a look at the history. Moments ago I told you about this original well pointed out down here. It was an old well that was drilled in about 1910, plugged somewhere around 1912, over a century ago. Sometime after that, it began flowing. We don't know exactly when. Anyway, we'll jump ahead to 1965. We can definitely say it was flowing. And in January of 1968, decision was made to plug this well again. Well and good, that was done. Almost immediately, a number of producing gas wells around this well stopped producing. They were flooded out. This caused such great concern that a relief well was put in beside the original well in December of '68. The water from this relief well was discharged directly into Big Creek. This was well and good until we got to the environmental stewardship of the current century, and it was decided you can't put a contaminant in the creek. So the well was plugged. 2015, the well plugged. Shortly after that, 4 other wells, here shown in yellow, started to flow. There was spotty flow up at the Forestry Farm well, on and off, and in a spring just to the north of that. So, can't have flowing wells, so 2 years later, these 4 wells that were flowing were plugged. At this time, 2 other wells, what we call the Edwards well down here, and the Forestry Farm well began to flow in earnest. And also there was flow just to the north of that at a spring up here. And that's pretty much the condition we find ourselves in today. There was one further development, was that in an attempt to investigate the Forestry Farm well site, a monitoring well was attempted to be put down fairly close by to that. What happened was they got the well down to the bedrock. Flows at that point were so great that they had to immediately abandon the monitoring well and seal it up. Now this is just a diagram that sort of goes through what I said, that really you plug one well, another well flows. There's the relief well, the 4 wells flowing, and so on and so forth. One thing I'd just like to point out here, the Forestry Farm well, as far as we can tell, is flowing at a fairly modest rate of 55 cubic meters per day. You know, it's not great. The failed monitoring well is flowing at 1,635 cubic meters per day. A couple of possible explanations for this is the Forestry Farm well, as opposed to the other wells, the ones that are flowing, was plugged in the past, back in 1958, I believe. So it had 8 plugs put in the well. So if 1 or maybe 2 of them have partially failed, some water could be bypassing them. The other explanation is it's coming up and it's going sideways into the drift, so not all the water that's from the bedrock is making it to surface. The figures we have here, and I realize you can't read all of them, are, say, a little shaky. There weren't definite measurements taken when these wells were flowing, other than on the failed monitoring well. So we're dealing with that, and we're going on people's observations at the time. So if I can jump into really a lot of what we did, and I'm going to give this very short shift. The modeling development is really a talk on itself. Suffice it to say, we took all the information that was available, all the geologic information, all the hydrogeologic information, developed conceptual site models for both the geology and the hydrogeology, and looked at the material properties, transmissivity, hydroconductivity, storage, so on and so forth. And then we matched this to the sequence and pressures that we saw in the flowing wells. So we used the data we had to inform the model. So these two, then we got it to work, and it obeys all natural laws, if you like. Now that we have this model, we can use it going forward. So if we make a change to the existing system, drill a new well or plug a well, we can predict the results from that. Which leads us to then just some of the information that came out of this. This is the diagram, of course, at the top. What you see here is a bunch of lines, and I apologize for that, but these are the contour lines of the piezometric surface, where the water rises up to. If we go back to 2015, when the relief well was plugged, I've just highlighted one contour line. This is a 206 contour line. So there it is, sitting just north of the original well. When the Jake well was plugged, and this flowed at about 4,000 cubic meters per day, it was a good floor, you can see the piezometric surface rises to the north, so pressure's building to the north. When we plug the other 3 wells, it rises still further, so now it's even north of the Forestry Farm well. So we're making changes to the aquifer when we change and plug various wells. One thing you'll notice that the contours at the bottom really haven't changed all that much. So they haven't gone down, but at least they haven't gone up. I'll go over this quite quickly, but with the steering committee at Norfolk County, they sat down and they had us evaluate various options. And just in the interest of time, we'll go through, each one had pros and cons. So we'll go through these one at a time. The first one was to plug the Forestry Farm well. And what happens there? Well, what the model shows is around the well itself, you get a slight increase. The well wasn't flowing that much, 55 cubic meters a day. However, you're transferring that pressure to the south, so the wells down here are likely to flow, particularly that Edwards well down here. This depiction is based on the assumption that no other wells will start flowing, and you can use your own judgment whether that's a realistic assessment. So the pros, the problem at Forestry Farm well is solved. That's good. The negatives, you're probably transferring the problem to somebody else. The well could be a little tricky to plug, since we believe the casing was pulled and there are plugs in the well itself. And it's going to be a little bit expensive. Okay. Option 2 was just collect the water at the forestry farm well, treat it, because you can't dump it back into the creek, so just run this. So you solve the problem at the forestry farm well, at least temporarily. The flow is not undue. Industry technology can handle this fairly easily. The problem here is you now set up a system that you have to maintain virtually forever. And should that flow increase to anywhere near what the failed monitoring well did, your infrastructure is going to be quickly overwhelmed. And there's always a possibility the regulators could come back and say, plug the well anyway. So you're on thin ice on a couple of accounts there. Option 3 and option 4 are actually two sides of the same coin. Option 3 is to put a relief well down nearest the forestry farm well. Okay, well and good. It's not hard to do, and we simulated pumping this at 3,585 cubic meters a day. And for reference, that's about 1.5 to 2 Olympic swimming pools a day. Okay. So the trouble here is you'll stop the flow at the forestry farm well in the spring up here, but the effects of pumping this much don't go that far, really just 1 kilometer or 2. So the wells that are flowing down the south are going to continue to flow. Again, your problem is solved at the forestry farm well. The negatives to this is, because you're affecting a regional aquifer, you're going to have to go through an environmental assessment. You're going to have to design and build a sewage treatment facility, essentially, to handle this volume of water. And you're going to have to maintain this going forward. Okay. So if we go ahead and simulate the what existed back in the day of a relief well down around the original well, yeah, you'll lower that. You'll stop flow at the Edwards well. You may or may not stop flow at the forestry farm well at the 3515 cubic meters a day. The same thing happens. You may get more flowing wells. You're still going through this large capital outlay at the start. So if we looked at in the time cost benefit thing, the flowing well, plugging it, well, you can do that relatively quickly, so you get it done in a year. It's not going to be cheap. I think your budgets sort of start at $500,000 and go up from there, but your problem's done, at least for Norfolk County. If you capture and flow, cheapest option to start. No question about that. You could implement it fairly quickly. Your costs go on forever. So choose your poisons, short at the start and long at the end. Environmental assessment probably is going to go on for at least a couple of years, design and build, and then operate and maintenance. After discussion, back and forth, and I believe some discussions with the ministry, Norfolk has elected to plug the well with assistance from the ministry, I understand. A couple of quick points here. The good news is about 75% of the wells in the Big Creek Valley and the surrounding area are plugged. You have to take this with a grain of salt because they've been plugged for over 100 years. And if I can just draw your attention to this 12% that have been plugged up to the mid-60s, a lot of these were using technology of lead plugs and wood plugs. And in fact, the original well and the forestry farm well, these were wells that failed with that technology in use. After this date, you see the use of more and more cement. The wells that seem at greatest risk are the active wells, or the unknown ones, I guess, and you're looking at about 25%. Because these, once the casing goes, you have that express train to surface. Okay. So in summary, unfortunately, I think probably on and off flowing wells in the Big Creek Valley are going to be a concern. The wells that most at risk are those that are unplugged or active, not because they aren't maintained, it's just because the geochemistry of the water is working against them, and those with older plugging. Some of the older plugging, you go into the records, and I mean, it's nothing more than gravel dumped down the hole, and maybe 1 or 2 plugs. As I hope I've shown, the Dundee Aquifer has to be treated as a regional feature. You do something at one place, it's going to transfer the pressures somewhere else. Okay, and this, of course, raises the consideration that what you do somewhere is affecting somebody else, and that has to be considered in the bigger scheme of things. That's it. Thank you for your attention.